And welcome back. I hope you had a chance to get a good break and maybe something to eat, and you're ready to go because we have another exciting session lined up now. Just before we begin, somebody has asked me to put the link to the recording in the chat. So there you are, those of you who are on the chat. If you're watching the recording afterwards, you won't see the chat. But go to unitedinlearning.com/recordings or upcoming, go to unitedinlearning.com, look for webinars, and then click on recordings, and you should find all of the recordings that we have available there. So we've got another exciting speaker lined up, and Jamie is going to introduce her. So, Jamie, over to you.
I just got to meet Sara online, and welcome. It's wonderful to have you. Sara has served the United Church of Canada as Reconciliation and Indigenous Justice Animator since 2015. Prior to that, she worked for 16 years as an educator and communicator for the ecumenical agency Kairos and taught history. She's a Newfoundlander, as we found out quickly. We got talking about cod and jigs dinner, and raised in Corner Brook. And hopefully I get the pronunciation correct, Kalipu Mi'kmaq territory. And shaped by her.
How about, Halibu.
Kalipu, okay, thank you. And shaped by, get a load of this, shaped by her family's almost 300-year history in the northwestern Buena Vista Bay part of the traditional territory of the Beothuk. How's that? Sara has a PhD in history from York University, and in her spare time, cooks, gardens, and watches birds. Married to Kelly, who is a librarian. And we look forward, Sara, to a workshop around reconciliation to reparation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jamie. And it's nice to see a whole bunch of familiar faces. And some faces aren't familiar, but names are, and that's nice to see as well. So I'm going to run a PowerPoint, and we'll get started. Oops. I'll get started. Is that okay for folks? Do you see that okay?
Looks good, Sara, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So here you see, here's the introductory slide. And the first thing I wanted to, I'm not advancing here. Whoops, no, I'm advancing too much. I wanted to do a land acknowledgement, and I know that the standard kind of thing I've noticed over the last 18 months in United Church of Canada Zoom meetings is that we ask for a land acknowledgement, and everybody runs over to the chat box and starts writing in the name of the territory of either the territory of the people who were here before Europeans came, which is the map you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, or the territory of the treaties. These are historical treaties here in the other graphic. We write those in as quickly as we can. And if you want to write those in, that's absolutely fine. But I'm hoping that we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about why we're writing those names in, or why we acknowledge them ourselves. Because I don't think land acknowledgements do what they're meant to do if all we do is read them off a piece of paper or throw them in a box really, really quickly. I think it's a time to acknowledge to yourself where and with whom you live. It's time to think about the relationship you do or don't have with the land, the people, the treaties of the area, if you're in a treaty area. And to think about what your responsibilities are to the land, to the people, and to the treaties. And so I'd like us to sort of just take a moment and think about that. And I'd also like to, Jamie struggled a bit with the name of the Halibu Mi'kmaq, which are the people whose territory my family now lives on. And that's okay, because it's not a combination of letters that we're used to seeing in English. And so when we see it for the first time, it's like, oh, how do you say that? And I think it's important that we take the time to actually learn how to say the name of the people with whom we share the land as well. And that may seem like a small thing, but I think if we can all commit to doing that, then that's one step in making sure that we're making a land acknowledgement that is maybe a little bit richer than simply writing the name down. It's important to know how to say it, and it's important to know how you're going to be in relationship with those people and with the land. So if we could think about that moving forward in our land acknowledgements, I think that would be a step. So there's a number of things I hope we can achieve in our time together today. I'm going to be talking in sort of 3 chunks. In between the first and the second chunk of time, we'll have some time to do some reflection in the chat box. And then at the end, we'll have some time to reflect verbally, I hope. So the goals here are to explore and reflect on the United Church of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples and its path of reconciliation. To learn about the United Church of Canada's response to the ongoing announcements regarding unmarked graves on residential school properties or residential institution properties, and to consider the path from reconciliation to reparation, to contemplate how this can transform us. And I want to be super clear that I'm not giving the entire history of the United Church of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples today. That's a separate workshop. And I'm also telling the story from the perspective of someone who is a settler. And it's important that I be upfront with that this story would be told to you in a different way if it were told by one of my Indigenous colleagues. So that's what we hope to achieve today. So let's talk about this path of reconciliation. We often begin talking about this with the 1986 apology, which is now 35 years old, and which we often see as an act from the non-Indigenous church to the Indigenous church. This is a picture. These are pictures of 2 of the main players in that apology. On the right is, or at least on my right, as I'm looking at the screen, is Alberta Billy, a representative to the Native Ministries Council, who in November, I think, of 1985, spoke at General Council Executive and said that the church owed Indigenous peoples an apology. And the other person is, of course, former moderator Bob Smith, who in August of 1986 delivered that apology in Sudbury at the General Council. And these pictures were taken of them 5 years ago in 2016 at the 30th anniversary of the apology. And that is Bob re-delivering the apology at the site where he gave it 30 years prior, and Alberta listening to him. You can't really have a path of reconciliation unless you have something to reconcile. It's not a natural state. In our church's case, it was our participation from our earliest moments as Methodist and Presbyterian ministries in the Canadian colonial venture to Christianize Indigenous peoples and remove them from their language, culture, and land. I want to stop here for a minute because I've forgotten a really important step. I want to acknowledge that there are people here who may very well be survivors or intergenerational survivors of residential schools. And I want to acknowledge them and to let them know that we are going to be talking about this and that may cause, that may trigger. So I apologize for not having begun with that. So we were part of a colonial system, a colonial venture to remove people from their language, culture, and land. And the best known example of our participation in that as a church is, of course, the residential school system. And I will tell you that we're struggling right now when we talk about residential schools. That is their legal name, but we are having a hard time, many of us, continuing to use the word school for those institutions. So you may hear in me and in other staff people from the United Church, you may hear us using different words to describe them. Anyway, the United Church operated 15 residential institutions from Ontario to British Columbia and is responsible for about 10% of the children who were forced to attend them. And it was about 150,000 children who attended these schools in total. So those children were removed from their communities, many of them hundreds of miles away. People came from the high north to Brandon, Manitoba, for example. Many did not return home for years. Survivors have recounted their experiences of cultural, physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. They lost their language, their connection to family and land, and many of them died as non-Indigenous people became increasingly aware of this summer. Now, the schools didn't operate in isolation. They emerged from a system of colonialism and racism that predated them for hundreds of years, and that you would have learned about if you've done a Kairos blanket exercise, and I'm sure many of you have. And that system continues today, 24 years after the last residential school closed. The church was and is very much a part of that system, which also includes the day school system, where we operated over 100 schools, the 60s scoop, and the ongoing millennial scoop and discriminatory funding of child welfare systems. And incidentally, Stephen mentioned recorded United in Learning webinars. There's an excellent one that my colleague Springwater put together a little while ago to mark Orange Shirt Day that traces the history of what happened to Indigenous children from residential schools through to the current day. It's an all Indigenous panel discussing this, and it's really worth your while to go and take a look at that. So that's what we had to reconcile, our participation in that system. But there's something else you need to reconcile, and that's the desire to do so. And it doesn't generally occur to institutions that participate in these kinds of systems that they have anything to reconcile or apologize for. The church didn't apologize of its own accord in 1986 for its role in colonization and the destruction of Indigenous cultures, language, and spirituality. It only apologized because Indigenous peoples within the church were organized, knew their rights, and demanded an apology, as they would subsequently use that same knowledge of their rights and organizing ability to create a self-determining Indigenous church. We also didn't apologize of our own accord in 1998 for residential schools, or join in the settlement agreement, agree to the settlement agreement that dealt with residential schools in 2006. We only did that, we only made those apologies because Indigenous peoples made us do that. With respect to residential schools, it was particularly the impact of lawsuits that made us recognize our culpability and realize that we had to pursue a different path than the one we had been for over 100 years. And it's really important to know that it was United Church members who were residential school survivors who made us see how broken the relationship with Indigenous peoples was. And they articulated these 6 principles of right relationship that should guide our response to residential schools. That we should always look at what we were doing in the past and how we were looking to address it in the present through a lens of anti-racism and decolonization. That we needed to understand abuse was far bigger than physical abuse. There was physical abuse, there was sexual abuse, there was psychological abuse, there was cultural abuse and spiritual abuse. And these all went together. That Indigenous peoples had to be fully involved in the solutions, and that Indigenous communities needed to be involved in the healing from residential schools. It wasn't just about the one person who went to a school from this family. It was about their entire family. It was about that entire family's relationship with the community. It was about the entire community. that there needed to be healing for Indigenous people, but there also needed to be education for non-Indigenous people if reconciliation was to have any hope. And that we had to be working together to build right relations. And from this came, of course, the Living into Right Relations Network, which was such an important part of the church's participation in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we agreed to the settlement agreement in 2006, and it came into effect in 2007. And it led us to some very important steps. You'll recognize this image of the Bentwood box, which was present at every Truth and Reconciliation Commission national event, and into which expressions of reconciliation were offered. So the settlement agreement led us to some very important steps in reconciliation. Participation in compensation processes. Now, these were not perfect. They were far from perfect. They didn't fully compensate people for what they went through, but they provided some measure of compensation for abuse and for loss of culture and language. We also participated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because of the settlement agreement. It is a component of the settlement agreement. And we also began working on the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action because of that. When the calls to action were released in 2015, we accepted them fully and saw it as our responsibility as a church, as a perpetrator in the residential school system, to work on these calls to action. And some of the ones in particular that were directed to us and that we have been working on, some of them before the TRC was concluded: repudiation of colonial doctrines, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, acceptance of Indigenous spirituality, adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, ongoing education for reconciliation, such as an event like this, work on memorialization, most recently support for a national monument in Ottawa, covenant of reconciliation, something that we have been trying to work on since December of 2015, and it's something that is very slow, but is making some steps forward, or at least it was prior to the call of the election and the discovery of unmarked graves. We'll see how that goes. The United Church also, particularly in communities like Brandon, File Hills in Saskatchewan, and Red Deer in Alberta, United Church people had also been involved in some work around grave sites, working with community or supporting community, local community in that work. So some of that had been going on. So that's kind of a quick run through of the path of reconciliation. And this question is the one that I would like you to think about in the chat box. I'm going to leave it up for a minute, and then I'm going to turn off the screen share so I can read the chat box with you. But how were you feeling, from your position in the United Church, whether that's minister, staff, member? How were you feeling at any of these points in time, say from 86 to now, about how the church was doing in the work of reconciliation? I'll just stop the screen. And I will see if I can paste that in the box for you. Just give me a sec.
Sure, no problem. It always takes a minute for people to type and push enter. So Kenji says, embarrassed, empowered, enlightened.
This is the embarrassing part where I can never find the chat. I was in a meeting the other day doing it, and I said, "Where?"
I'm happy to read it to you, Sarah, because it doesn't get into the recording anyway.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, Jamie is wondering about, are you asking about the national church or local church context?
Whatever. How were you feeling about the church's work on reconciliation, whether it was your own congregation, whether it was the national churches? Yeah. That's an interesting question, because were you in step with each other or not?
Kathleen says, I've gone from extreme rage and embarrassment at being part of the church to trying to learn all I can and participate as an individual who cares. Monica says, ashamed, guilty, overwhelmed on what to do next. People come up to me saying they'll never trust the church again. Initially, says John, disengaged and gradually being drawn into a deep desire to both deal with the moral stress this was placing on my psyche and wanting to put my energy into making a contribution to justice making.
I think that's a very, it's very well worded, but and people might not word it as articulately as that, but I think that that is a very common reaction. I don't want to see this, right? Or I can't see this, to then being overwhelmed by it. And then you were somehow transformed to be able to do something. But I think that is a common reaction on the part of non-Indigenous people to this particular example.
Maggie says the church has made a beginning, but it struggles yet with truth-telling.
Absolutely.
And Jamie says locally frustration. Congregants don't want to go there. And Laurie says at times proud of our apologies and involvement, and then hopeful, and then frustrated in a 6-year involvement with the Native Friendship Center. Mary says there's a responsibility to push the justice effort beyond the congregational level to the community, school curriculums, and so on. Laurie says it's just been hard to bear the pain.
Yeah, Mary has been part of an interesting community project to spread the word in the community. In Canmore, they set up tables in the street, Main Street outside the church every Sunday through September to talk to people about this. It was a really interesting initiative.
Kim says it's been a very slow process. Some churches don't even celebrate the Indigenous Sunday of Prayer when it's a day, like an opportunity to talk about the issue, have dialogues and so on. Samuel says it's fine, and I think the reconciliation should be genuine, not just things written on paper, but practically practiced and preached.
Samuel, you're very much in line with much of what was said yesterday in the community of Kamloops, Shweknak, when the Prime Minister showed up to make an apology for not having gone to an event he was invited to on September 30th. And this was reiterated to him by the local chief, the regional chief, and the national chief over and over again. This has to stop being words. It has to be something, practical actions.
Pamela says, concerned that reconciliation efforts are more for show. Look how good we are, and actually helpful in the work of real justice.
Yeah, there's a tendency, isn't there, to want to do this, right? Pat yourself on the back. We've done this, we've apologized, but what does that actually really mean if it's not changing things? Maggie Dieter, who's here, used to work with me, and we would often say, this doesn't mean anything until there's no more boil water advisories on, you know? And there were other examples we would give as well, but that's one of them.
Reed says, I came into the United Church of Canada in 1997, so I was ignorant of the history, but I've learned much. I feel sad at what's happened, amazed at the resilience and continuing hope expressed by so many Indigenous people. And Greg says, I just felt ignorant. I'd have to know how Indigenous people are experiencing our reconciliation efforts, not just what we've done to try reconciling.
Yeah.
And Bruce echoes that. I have a feeling like I don't know enough yet. Ryan says, encouraged that we've moved beyond thinking that we have the only way of being and that this means a more Christian way for us to be as a church. Wonder about people who tried to open this discussion up earlier on, like Kevin Annett. Should we be having watch parties of unrepentant, looking at the journey within the denomination as well as listening to survivals and Indigenous communities? Laurie says, I've also witnessed to the pain and confusion of those who taught at residential schools. and some who adopted and raised children and thought they were fulfilling their call.
And that's a very real dynamic, right? We've been asked to do this as part of our Christian calling, and then your understanding changes, and that must feel very dislocated, and it must feel to be trying to tell the truth, and not being heard or listened to, or that's difficult. And many survivors went through that, right? And we see that this summer as well. Well, we've told you this. We knew these children were not returned home.
Sundo says, my local congregation feels humble and grateful as they've just started our journey of walking along with First Nations in town and neighboring Flying Dust people when we attended a local event on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and spoke publicly of our words of commitment there.
So the possibility for beginnings of relationship, going back to some earlier comments, really what the church has done is a beginning. It's just a beginning.
Eric says, I feel caught in the crossfire. Regret the initiatives of our Canadian government and the willingness of the churches to fully participate in actions so strange for any family member to imagine for their own offspring. I'm also distressed that after so many botched initiatives by our government, boil water advisories and so on, the crisis continues.
I think there's something to learn here about that very first principle of reconciliation that United Church Residential School Survivors named for us as a church to take on, which is to approach this from a position of anti-racism and decolonization. And the church now, with its new, I shouldn't say new, its renewed emphasis on becoming an anti-racist denomination, work which really sort of emerged out of General Council 43 and then George Floyd's murder and other issues. All these things that have been named about our government's policy and our church going along with it, we have to put ourselves in that lens. We have to apply that anti-racism and decolonizing lens when we look at policy. And so that's something that has to shift. If boil water advisories are going to end, then racist policy needs to be changed so that they can end. And the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal is saying that with respect to child welfare funding, for example. So that point is a very, very important point that we need to remember, I think, as we try and move towards some kind of transformation.
And says she felt humbled and challenged, and she's learning to patiently listen to the stories. Laurie says, I was at the Senate meeting the first time when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons was turned down by some senators from the West. I was trembling with rage and helpless. Kim says, advocacy work on reconciliation, raising awareness on residential schools and the horrors of the aftermath of the abuses are not on priority list of faith communities. I'm grateful that our congregation is on the path of showing our support to the reconciliation process. And Kenji says, also weary of rationalization and justification that dodge the issue and misdirect our attention. Paul and Marilyn say, we've become more aware of the impact of residential school and treatment on active people through experiencing the Kairos blanket exercise and presenting it to our church community and for the staff at our high school, as well as some classes. Always participants have commented on how this information hadn't been taught.
One of Senator St. Clair's most important statements, I think, was education. Education, I would put in quotation marks, is what got us into this mess. And education, by which I mean proper education, is what's going to get us out. And that's really important. And that has been a lesson for me this summer, answering the moderators' emails about unmarked graves or unmarked burial sites. There are still people, and maybe they're new to the United Church, who didn't understand the depth of our engagement or our involvement in this system at all. And it's a continual process of education that we need to be providing. It feels like everybody's had a chance to.
I was just going to say, I think I'll get out of the way and let you carry on.
Okay. Feels like everyone's had a chance to have a conversation. And I've seen a lot of familiar themes being raised. And so let's just carry on as I share my screen again. Stephen, just let me know if that's okay.
Looks good from here.
Okay. So moving to 2021, summer of 2021, a summer of truth telling, not a story of news, but a story of truth, a summer of truth telling. This is a collage of pictures from Kamloops, Secwepemc First Nation that my colleague Julie Graham from Living Skies region put together on a trip she did there this summer. You see the land, you see the school, you see the memorial, the official memorial to students who died at the school, known students who died, and the memorials that sprang up this summer after the announcement of the graves that had been positively identified. Sorry, the burial sites. I hesitate to call them graves if they're not marked or in a graveyard. So this past summer, there was a really significant interruption in the narrative of reconciliation. On May 28th, Kamloops Secwepemc First Nation announced that it had confirmed evidence of up to 215 unmarked graves on the grounds of the former Kamloops residential institution. This was not news to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. It was what they had always known and had been telling people since before the TRC. And in the weeks that followed, you'll remember that there were other announcements of similar confirmations. So it's not news, but it was an interruption to how many non-Indigenous people understood the work of reconciliation. And it immediately began to reverberate across the country. I think many non-Indigenous people had no idea that this was the case because they weren't listening. Or they had stopped listening. We at the General Counsel Office and colleagues in regional offices were receiving all kinds of letters from people from across the church. They were confused, they were angry, they were full of sorrow, full of repentance, and they wanted the United Church to do something. Please do something as soon as possible. Our initial response, which first came from the Executive Minister for Indigenous Ministries, Mary Pruden, was directed to communities in the Indigenous Church. Many of those people are survivors or intergenerational survivors, and this hit them hard. And so he communicated with them in prayerful support. The moderator, who everyone was expecting to respond as well, was on a retreat where he was completely out of contact with the news, with social media, and with the office. And so he didn't know anything about this until about 2 days later. But then he did offer a prayer of support for the whole church, and he continued to offer prayers of support to the church, the Indigenous church in particular, and ministry staff throughout the summer. So that was the first weekend. And then we listened to some wisdom from within Indigenous membership, from within our staff circle, which is predominantly Indigenous people. And we marked 4 days of mourning and prayer for the children who did not come home from Kamloops. That was our first response. It was difficult for many non-Indigenous people, to accept that they weren't doing something right away. And some feared that our response would only be prayer. But through many conversations and consideration of the commitments that we made in the name of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and in the calls to the church, which is the foundational document of the Indigenous Church, we arrived at an initiative rooted in the principle of reparative justice to help bring the children home. And that initiative is called Bringing the Children Home. There are a couple of elements to it that I just want to tell you about. The first is around archives and records. And that in that part of the work, we have committed to a new archival and oral history project to find and consolidate all materials related to deaths and burials at the residential schools that we ran. This work is being supported by a grant from the United Church of Canada Foundation. We're also supporting community efforts. We've reached out to the leadership of the communities most affected by the institutions that we ran to offer our financial assistance in their work of honoring the children, whether it is related to knowledge gathering, so speaking to elders and others about what they know about the property, what they know about the school, what they know about the children, land-based research, so that could be, it could be mapping, it could be ground penetrating radar, preservation, so marking the places off where we know or suspect there may be children buried, ceremony to honor those children, much of which would have to happen before anything else would happen, actually. Memorialization, plaques, individual markers, or any other steps that the community feels necessary. And what's important here is that it's the community that directs this. It's not the United Church that says, well, we operated the school at Morley. Therefore, we will go into Morley. We will scan all the grounds, even if we do it in the right process. We'll do all of this. We'll mark graves. We don't make that decision. These aren't our children. It's Morley that will make that decision. And if they want our help, then we will help them do that. But they will determine how to do it, when to do it, and whether we can help or not. So the General Council Executive has approved $3 million for this work. And I'm happy to tell you that the moderator and the General Secretary are currently in conversation with several communities to see where and how this might move forward. And they're conversations about relationship. And I think that is really important. In some respects, these two pieces of work, archival work and supporting the communities, are not new. Our national and regional archives released all of our records to the TRC as the settlement agreement compelled us to. And these are now part of the official record of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Our archives have always been open to anybody who is survivor, family, community members who want the records. But now we're proactively compiling materials and providing communities who want them with a digital copy of all records related to the institution. So most recently, every document that we have on the Round Lake School, plus access to every record on the Round Lake School that the NCTR holds that we don't hold, so those would be federal records. We have provided copies of all of that in digital form to Opatcheway First Nation in Saskatchewan, which is the community closest to that school, and is doing work on that school. So that is a priority of archival staff and them to do that work. Several United Church communities were also already involved in work to identify and preserve grave sites on these properties. I mentioned Brandon, File Hills, and Red Deer. They either took on that work, as in the case of Red Deer, or supported community work, as in the case of File Hills and Brandon. The work of local Indigenous communities in recovering and preserving the graveyards and finding out as much as they could. And so that work had begun and was happening during the TRC period. what's interesting is that those cases were all about known graveyards, which is a very different thing, right? To what we are finding this summer. What we're dealing with now is different. The idea of any burial site on a school property is horrific, but for those burial sites to be unmarked and undocumented is of a completely different order in my mind than the existence of a graveyard. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recognized this in their calls to action that are related to missing children and burial sites, which is that they call for the churches and the government to follow Indigenous community leadership and protocol in determining how to honor the children. And that's the complete opposite of the way that we acted in the past. And it is, as the moderator said to survivors and communities this July, a commitment to help bring these children the honor that we denied them in life. So we're going to go to another time of reflection. That's some heavy stuff. A bit of a reflection on what feelings you experienced this summer, or thoughts. Don't have to get into your feelings if you don't want to. Feelings and thoughts you experienced this summer about the unmarked graves and the United Church response. Do the same as we did.
Kenji says dismay, resignation, shame, horror, shock, profound sadness, says Pamela. Sadness, but not disbelief, says Reed. Glad for Murray Pruden's words in the moderator's prayer, says Reed. Laurie just says sighs too deep for words. Defensiveness, says Monica, and anger that people didn't believe. We heard this at the TRCs, we knew about it, and yet people didn't care until it was staring us all in the face. And John says, from my own horror, I was so grateful that there was a response from the United Church of Canada and not equivocation. How polar opposite, says Walter, to what we thought we should be doing as a faith community. Stress, says Beth. How to respond and not react, how to address denial, my own and others, how not to do more harm.
I really want to pick up on that comment on harm that Beth has made, because this caused deep harm to be re-traumatize people. Again, I had in my head yesterday's event in Kamloops, and one of the chiefs, I believe it was the national chief, saying, you have to remember that people were on their way, many people were on their way to a healing path, and they have been set back so many steps by this. I mentioned to you that we saw pain in Indigenous communities of faith in the United Church. We saw pain in our staff team. It was a heavy load. It is still a heavy load. And I think as those of us who are non-Indigenous need to remember that this is not just a news story, right? This is people's life being laid out in front of us over and over again. And we have to carry that carefully. We have to carry our response to it carefully.
Mary was personally involved in the 60s scoop. She says, I had mixed feelings of relief for my son, but deep regret for both the lost children and their parents. And Ryan echoes Reed's comment from earlier, sad but not at all surprised, hopeful that we're actively trying to move forward. Maggie says, devastating to uncover the degree of neglect of Canada. Yet the truth cannot be buried. I appreciate the statement and interruption of the reconciliation narrative. Very true. The script is unraveling as it needs to. Will we stop listening? Eric says, somehow not so surprised, uncomfortable with the retrospective news and the rush to do something so we can all feel better. I would like to see an ongoing historical research and reflection on how did this happen with unflinching willingness to also ask how we today need to change, and then to pursue over the coming decades a response that demonstrates repentance in action, a new bonding between settler descendants and First Nations towards a new kind of Canada. Anne just wonders if the truth really will set any of us free. So much was done in the name of Christ, says Laurie. How do we even redeem that message? It's heartbreaking, says Kim. It moved me and my ministry team partner to put together a letter of solidarity and circulated it to members of our congregation. And Pamela is glad that the overall Canadian response was anger that this was allowed to happen. Perhaps our society is learning, she says. And Paul and Marilyn acknowledged the harm we had caused Indigenous people became clear and visible. Monica adds, and also a little bit of pride in what people have already done around the Red Deer Industrial School before this came out. Frustrated, says Kenji, that it required such a garish and grotesque accounting of number to engage Canadian society.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, these are all excellent points. I can't speak to every one of them, but I think the point about we only, as non-Indigenous people, we're responding to this because of the level, the immensity of it. It shouldn't take an immensity of this, right?
One is too many.
Yeah.
Maggie says, she reminds us of Christine Jarrett's comment this morning, until the truth is spoken, the gospel hasn't been heard.
Feels like truth is being spoken now. I mean, someone said to me when the first few times we came together as a staff team to figure out how we're going to respond, one of my colleagues said, we're starting over again now. Like everything that happened, all that TRC, that's done now. We're starting step one. We're right back at step one. And I think there's a truth in that.
Well, the premise of the TRC was the truth would be told, and it wasn't heard.
Yeah, I think some of us believed we thought it had been heard, and I very clearly it had not. And there were certain things that were done that were the easy things to do, the low-hanging fruit. Name a national day. That's fairly easy, although it still took 5 years to do it, but 6 years to do it. But the deep structural pieces that are really hard, that the TRC called for, I worry for them now. But since February of 2020, working really intensely on the Covenant of Reconciliation, and I have to tell you, I don't know where that's going to go in light of this, and some of the news stories coming out around other parties' willingness to engage or not engage in truth telling. I don't know how that's going to go.
And yet Mary finds hope in the sense that she was talking with people on the street in September, and kids knew more than their parents about this. Well, maybe there's some generational change beginning. Kim says the news starkly proved the gruesome effects of uprooting Indigenous children from their families and culture. It reflected a thwarted system of subjugation that still affects the Indigenous communities today.
Yeah, that colonial system hasn't gone anywhere. It takes different forms. And again, I point you to that United in Learning webinar on Indigenous children, then, now, and tomorrow. Which explores some of that.
I hope we stay the course, says Maggie. This is the middle stuff. This is the Holy Saturday stuff she's pointing out, reminding us again of Christine Jarrett's lecture.
So I have to thank Maggie for filling me in on the rest of the conference. This is great. I feel like I've attended a bit more of the conference now than I have. But yeah, it's that time of waiting, right? It's that time of in between. Yeah.
Well, and in Good Friday and Holy Saturday, the people who lived through it didn't know Easter was coming.
No, exactly. They didn't know what they were waiting for.
No.
We think we we think we know, but I'm not even sure we know.
Our children and our children's education, says Jamie, needs to include education of the history of our country's treatment of our Indigenous peoples and what happened.
I think that, you know, that, as I said earlier, education around Indigenous peoples, around history, around culture is fundamental.
So impressed, says Laurie, by the efforts of the CBC and the NAC to lift up the stories and creative gifts of Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis artists.
So let's, I'm looking at my phone to see the time.
Sure.
So let's
Please carry on.
carry on for the next bit. And then we're not going to do another chat box thing. We're going to do actual talking like grown-ups after the next little bit of sharing. And I'm really going to be relying on you in a big way in the next part, because you're the people who do the preaching. And I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on the questions I'm going to raise in the next bit. You okay, Stephen?
Yes, absolutely.
So I want to talk a bit about, I mentioned that we framed, well, sorry, my cat is in the way. Excuse me 1 minute. That we very much understood what we were doing to be a form of reparation. It is a response to calls to action 73 to 76, but it's also an act of reparation. I think that reparations for our treatment, our churches, our institutions' treatment of Indigenous peoples is a question that all churches need to be considering. We have been thinking about it for a while in the United Church. We're thinking about reparations in other contexts as well, but I'm speaking about the context of Indigenous people, or treatment of Indigenous people rather. And I think that the National Anglican Indigenous Archbishop, Mark MacDonald, summed it up really well in this statement from a few years ago when he was just a lowly bishop. He was talking about the various situations facing Indigenous peoples, and he says they are related to the policy and programs of government and church that displaced Indigenous communities, created massive societal disruption, and disabled the capacity for self-determination and self-sufficiency. The people and the institutions that pursued these policies and benefited from them need to make amends. To me, that's a pretty strong call to reparative justice or reparations, however you want to label it. I would say that the United Church has undertaken many actions in relationship with Indigenous peoples that are reparative in nature. But it's important to note that they're actions. They're not a systematic program of reparative justice. Things that we could look at in this vein are the apologies, the financial terms of the settlement agreement that meets a classic definition of financial reparation, the truth telling at the TRC, regional decisions about sharing revenue from surplus property sales. I think all of the regions now have passed policies around sharing resources from surplus property sales into a fund for the Indigenous church. And that was a direct response to the calls to the church, which talked about, so one of them was around sustainability. So this is in our context. We have talked about it. We have done things that, looking back, we can see fit a pattern of reparation. We've even returned land. I mean, there is a patch of land that Faith United in Kingston has either returned to or is sharing with Indigenous organizations to use for things like ceremony and land-based learning. There's a similar transfer of land in former Waterloo Presbytery, I think, and there's a transfer of land back to the First Nation in Southern Ontario as well, around Sarnia. So these things have been happening, but they're not systemic. They're not transformative, right? At least they're not yet. And I think that bringing the children home, the program, the name we've given our initiative, it feels like a part of that. It feels like trying to shift our relational position. And it emerges not just from a desire to be reconciled, but also from the reality that, as I said, these relationships are changing. It's only with a shift in the power, with an acknowledgement of the harm that has been created and a true shift in the power behind that, that reconciliation can actually happen. Can we have, is my question, can we have reconciliation without reparation? I don't know. And we're going outside the church in a way that we haven't had before. Most of our conversations around reconciliation have been within the church. And this initiative is really going outside, beyond the church, to the broader communities, to see how can we try and be reconciled with that larger number of people who we have historically harmed. I like this quotation from Margaret Urban Walker, an ethicist, American ethicist, who has reflected on the nature of reparative justice, because it gets at the question of transformation. It gets at the question of relationship. Not all losses can be made good. No wrongs can literally be made right. So although this is the case, the relationships at the root of the wrongs and the relationships that result from the wrongs can sometimes be corrected or transformed. And this seems to be an important part of what reparations are about. Her book is small. You can look it up and order it. It's small but expensive. And I found it a really helpful read. It gave a very big picture of what reparative justice means. People hear the word reparation and they think money. And it's about much more than that. It's about repairing relationship, transforming relationship. So I wanted to leave you with these two quotations from Archbishop Mark and from Dr. Walker around the need to make amends, the need to shift relationships, and the impact that can have. And to leave you with some questions, which again, I'll put the questions in the chat, but maybe we can actually talk face to face on this one. I'd like to hear from you where you see reparation in our biblical tradition or a scriptural tradition, our social gospel tradition. I'd like to see where you see the potential for reparation in your ministry, whether that's local or in the ministry of the United Church as a whole. Where do you see the potential for reparation? And what's your hope for how it might transform us? So maybe start collecting your thoughts. I will stop sharing and I will grab those questions for the chat, and we'll do as I said, we'll do a face-to-face conversation. I think we can just do the raise hand function probably, right, Stephen?
Sure, I think that's fine. So if you'd like to speak, raise your hand, or you know what, I think you can just open your mic and talk. There are only 27 of us here. So open your mic and start talking, and I'll find your video and spotlight you with Sara so we can see who's talking.
Okay, I'm just going to grab these questions. Antler River Watershed. Thank you, Kenji. That was the one I was searching for. That was the actual return of land to the Lenape, Delaware. Kenji's also done a reading recommendation people might be interested in. Dear White Christians, for those still longing for racial reconciliation. So where do you see reparation in our traditions and texts? Where do you see the potential for reparation and how might it transform us? Don't all jump at once.
Sarah.
Yes.
It's John Butter speaking. I'm wondering about the story of Jesus and Peter, the resurrection, post-resurrection story at the very end of John's gospel. And Jesus interrogating Peter, you know, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? This isn't exactly reparations, but it really strikes me as if we are being questioned in that kind of face-to-face encounter. My problem with the question about reparations in Scripture is nothing comes to mind. I'm totally blank on that, but I do go to that story, the resurrection story.
What are you willing to do? What is it that you were willing to do? If you know, in your love for me, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
That's what I'm getting at. Yeah, yeah.
Because there might be a cost of your discipleship.
I've done a little reading about moral injury, which, you know, a term that comes out of people's war experience. So I'm not feeling moral injury seems too stark a term, but moral stress definitely describes how I'm feeling. And if the Spirit is present in any of this, it's God through Indigenous people looking at me as a European descended individual and saying, okay, John, if you love God and Jesus and so on, what's your response?
Yeah. Back in the day when I worked, I don't know if folks here will remember the big campaign we did in the former coalitions for debt cancellation, the Jubilee Campaign. And we did more work than that, but we also did some work around Indigenous rights and ecology, but primary focus was around debt. And we used to look in, you know, what we call the Jubilee texts of what the theologians call the Jubilee texts. Leviticus and Deuteronomy for examples of reparative justice. And one of the passages was Deuteronomy 12 to 15. If a member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and works for you 6 years, in the 7th year you shall set that person free. And when you send a male slave out from you, a free person, you shall not send him out empty-handed. Provide liberally out of your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress, thus giving to him some of the bounty with which the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason, I lay this command upon you today. So we know there's tons of skepticism around the idea of a Jubilee, right? But as a sort of a guiding vision, is there something in the text like that which recompenses someone for what you had done? Is that something that could be called upon? I remember that text being used a lot.
As I was thinking about the invitation to think about a biblical story, I was finding it difficult to sort of really narrow in on one specific story, say, for example, in the gospel, because each one of those teachings or parables of Jesus is really about restoring, restoration, about justice, restoring people to community, restoring health. So reparation is woven into the message that is there in the gospel. I'll share a little story about what's happening locally here. That I've just recently connected with a community of Indigenous and settler women who gather at a Mennonite church just outside of Kitchener here. And this Mennonite church has given permission for this for a women's circle, essentially, to gather every Wednesday evening, has allowed for sacred fire to happen in their backyard, and has opened the church building so that the women can bring their children and use washrooms, etc. So I think once the weather gets cold, this women's circle will be allowed into the building. But it's a very simple yet profound gesture of trust, relationship, extending property and trust. I think that just that sacred fire can happen in between the church and the graveyard, and I think it's just such a profound thing to do, and to open up and share in that way. It's a simple and profound. So I wanted to share that little story. How might this transform us? I think for myself, there's a sense of overwhelm when we look at reconciliation and we feel that we can't act. And it's so simple. I remember an elder up at Cape Croker, maybe I've shared this with you before, Sarah, but she would often say, if it cost $1 million, everyone would think it would work and everyone would want it, but it's a simple act of sharing and reaching out and building relationships, but also offering something practical, a way for people to get onto the land again and share and build relationships.
I really like that example, Maggie, of the opening of the space, the providing the space, because we can be so protective of our space, right? This is ours, you can't. And I also really like finding that thread in the healing stories and what that means. I think that's really helpful. Kenji has hand up, and then it's.
I have Kenji and then Eric.
Oh, look at you, you're doing it. Okay.
Yeah, hi, Sarah. I guess a longstanding piece of mine, or I guess a pulpit to soapbox is that reconciliation can only be a byproduct, a consequence of something else. Like, we can't aim at reconciliation and hope to check off that box. Like, it can only be the organic upwelling of reparation. And so that was Jennifer Harvey's piece that I had put in the chat box, that reparation needs to be the focus of our attention and energy. And if we do that well, then that's where the reconciliation piece could happen. It's only possible when, I guess, the quote unquote dominant party adopts that posture of repentance and humbleness and of reparation. That piece moves forward. So I think, and that's a humbling realization that not many people are willing to make. I mean, that's an uncomfortable place, that we have to willingly put ourselves into. And it's the risk of, okay, what reparations then do we need to make as an institution, as a government, as a nation, to ensure that, I don't know, food security, clean water, like any of that, like there's a cost that is attached to it. And to be willing to name ourselves culpable and responsible for paying that cost is that risk that could entirely transform the way that the church and the nation exists, but is also terrifying for those that are fearful of scarcity, fearful of liability, fearful of all of that.
And I like what you said, there's a cost to all of these things. Like there's a cost to repair, right? But there's a cost we don't repair as well. And we've been paying that cost for over 100 years. Indigenous people have been paying that cost in particular. Yeah. Thanks, Kenji. Eric.
Thank you for your presentation, Sarah. I've been troubled by this business for many, many years in different places where I've lived. And it keeps coming back to me that this particular recent revelation that's come is a particularly egregious example of how sin is like a spider web into which we are all born. We find ourselves caught, complicit, and yet called to be responsible in the midst of that. And I take each of those words seriously because we are caught and complicit somehow simply by being born into this spider web. But our responsibility is to do something about it. And it seems to me that's where our faith comes in. That Jesus actually calls us in the caughtness of our circumstances. We cannot say that we're not responsible, even if things were done before we were ever born into the spider web. But Jesus invites us to pray and live in such a way that the Lord's Prayer risks becoming real. And I think specifically of his prayer, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. In other words, we are praying that heaven actually be something that's experienced through our words and our actions, individually in our little clusters, in our churches, and certainly in our society. We're asking that the reign of God in Jesus actually happen here and now. I'm very uncomfortable with the push to find, quick apologies, and that's a penchant of our current government, which I think it's like papering over things. I personally think we need to sit, as people used to say, we need to sit with the uncomfortable question. It's not going to go away quickly. If the First Nations have been dealing with this for 100 years, it strikes me that maybe that's an appropriate time frame within which we will need to continue to work. Reparation means repentance. Repentance means putting it into action, making ourselves vulnerable to the transformation that God's Spirit can bring. So I realize this is all just a lot of words in some respects. Some people will say, let's get to the brass tacks. Well, I don't know what the brass tacks are in my circumstance. I live in a small village on Vancouver Island where there is a First Nations group, of which I understand there's 2 or 3 people here, and the rest are scattered around. And finding ways responsibly and respectfully to engage, it's just a challenge for individuals and for churches and for all of us. So for me, simply naming this is really an important step in my own life, and I think for us as a church, for people who are trying to be faithful to Jesus as well, that we have to simply learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable for a while, like for years, and then take it from there. How does that sit with you, Sarah? I'm curious about your response. Thank you.
So that's, you're going to hit two sides of my personality now. You're going to hit the historian who knows that things take a long time to change, and that the powerful are reluctant to give up power. And so the realistic historian side of me says, I know you're right, it's going to take time. And even Justice Sinclair, you know, took us 7 generations to get into this. It's going to take us 7 generations to get out. I hope it won't take 7 generations to get clean drinking water, right? And so that meets the activist part of me who likes to plan campaigns and do things. But I did learn many years ago from going back to this debt campaign that I had worked on, from activists, in particular from the Philippines and Central America, who were working their whole lives around debt imposed by the colonial system or colonial systems, that they said, we don't want campaigns. We want movements. We want dedicated movements of people who will put things together, one foot in front of the other, and try and shift. That's the way you'll shift policy, and it does take longer. So I'm a little bit of both, if that's okay. But the one thing I worry about when I agree with you on empty promises or empty apologies, like I think apologies need to be made, but they need to be real and genuine. And I'm not convinced that all of the apologies we've been hearing lately are as genuine as they should be, because they're not backed up by anything. There are things we can do, and we shouldn't let ourselves get sidetracked by it's going to take a long time to get it right. The things that we can do, things that we have the power to change, we should start changing, you know, as soon as we can. And not unilaterally, but listening to the people who are the most affected. That's the way a movement works. So I don't know if that helps. I hope it does. Before we go, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, there's a question in the chat. There's 2 more on the speakers list. We've got 10 minutes left. How do you want to handle this, Sarah?
We will do the question in the chat because I had seen that as well. That's
Mary Shearer. She says, where does the Indigenous Council fit in the discussion of reparations? I have hope in the wisdom they might share.
So the Indigenous Council is still working very much on establishing itself. It had a bit of a difficult year, and there was a lot of change happening, and it's on a path now to trying to really determine. There's a bit of is it a region or is it a national body? There's a bit of a conversation happening about that. And it's working its way towards that. So it's been dealing with identity issues more than policy issues or programmatic issues. It's seen the work that we have done so far on reparations, and it will be part of a conversation. There has to be, I think a very first step is there has to be a conversation between probably the General Council Executive and the Council on reparations. And the earlier version of the Council, what was called the Aboriginal Ministries Council, it did do some preliminary discussion of reparations, and so on. So I think that will come into focus.
Great, thank you. So do you want to take 2 more speakers, or do you have some closing remarks you want to make? We've got 8 minutes left.
Let's do these 2 speakers. I think they're more important.
Okay. Hey, Kim, you were on the list. You've taken yourself off, but I can bring you up again.
Sure.
Great.
I was just thinking of the biblical story here about reparation, and what comes to mind is the story of the exile in the Old Testament. Of course, their situation began with some kind of a subjugation or colonization from the Assyrians or the Babylonians, and then, of course, when they came back, their culture, for sure, were tarnished by these colonizers, language, religion, everything, their way of life. when they came back, the very first thing they did was share their stories and experience. So I think reparation for me is an evolving process, and it starts by listening to the stories, taking notice, and not ignoring the voices of these people and the experience that they have had, and then go through the lamenting process. In the summer this year, I intentionally did a sermon series in the Book of Lamentations because of this particular story of the residential school children. So it's actually a good way of saying we've been through this. We've it's heartbreaking. It's something that is very hard for us, but we need to listen, not to ignore, and let's listen to the laments of the people. And then I think from there, reparation will take place. It will be a process that will be ongoing, and there is no deadline to it. That's all I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Samuel.
Ooh, you're not coming through, Samuel.
Yeah, sorry about that. Samuel, I'm sorry, we just can't hear you. I think we're having internet issues here. I apologize. Maybe you could put your comment in the chat, because I think you can hear me. If you can put your comment in the chat, then one of us could read it aloud. Would that be okay?
No problem.
Thank you.
We'll just wait a second for that then.
Sure. I think Samuel is not in Canada, and the internet where he is
Okay.
harder. We have a hard time with the internet in Africa. And Samuel is joining us from somewhere in that continent. I can't remember which country he's in. I'm sorry. Maggie's written a comment in the chat. Would you like to read that aloud, Sarah, while we wait for Samuel? Or would you like me to read it?
The story of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples is deeply ingrained in our Canadian identity. Royal Commission, OCA, the death of Dudley George, TRC, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and the ongoing mess with Indigenous child welfare are layers revealed. They are full of pain and tragedy. Full of pain and tragedy. The graves of children another layer. Building capacity for lament and action is what leaders can do.
Thanks. Thanks, Maggie.
I had a short closing thing to read from Richard Wagamese, but should I wait a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes, Stephen? I don't know.
I'm hoping we'll get a word or two from Samuel. But I'm aware also that it's 56 minutes past the hour, so we only have a couple more minutes. Why don't you close, and if Samuel has a chance to write into the chat, then those of us who have access to the chat will be able to read what he said.
This is very short, as many of the things from this book, Embers, are in a posthumous collection of some of his thoughts. It's called Working Together. Working together in the bush, sawing, cutting, and stacking the wood for winter is a return to simplicity. The feel of energies bent to a task and seeing it through is the stuff of community, and a realization of how much we let slip away to technology, the speed of things. Reach out, leave the keyboard, be with people. That's the spiritual.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for a powerful and thought-provoking afternoon. It always strikes me as so important that settlers talk to each other about these things. And all too often, we invite an Indigenous person to come and address us. That's valuable and important and part of relationship building, but we settlers need to hear from each other too. And most of us online today are settlers or descended from them. So thank you. Thank you for the stories that you brought, hard as they are to listen. Thank you for the detail that you have at your fingertips. Thank you for the passion that you share. Thank you for your realism about the complicated journey that we're on. I'm heartened that there are people like you leading our response, and honored to have you here with us today. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you all for showing up and participating as well as you did. It was really wonderful. And I kept saving the chat because there's ideas in there, and I'll be rewatching our conversation as well. So I really appreciated the time with you.
Indeed.
Go out and do good work, as they say.
Yeah. So friends, we have a half-hour break. I know that's not long. When we rejigged this workshop so that we could offer everything online, we had to find spaces for extra workshops. So it means we have less downtime, but we do have half an hour. Here's Samuel saying, in ascetical theology, it can mean an amendment for an insult given to God through sin. Ezra, really recording the fulfilling of God's promise. Interesting, and thank you. So take a half an hour break. We will come back at 3:30 and hear the second lecture from Christine Jarrett. News from the Margins. God's new future is already here. And she's got a couple of videos she's asked me to share. So let me just leave you with that teaser, and we'll look forward to the good news that she wants to share with us in 30 minutes. See you soon.